All right, my outstanding artists, we're going to talk about some watercolor techniques today. In order to get started, some things that we would need would be a watercolor palette, a paintbrush, and some nice watercolor paper, as well as a cup of water. Now I'm going to talk to you about 4 techniques that you could use within a watercolor painting. The first one is called blotting. In order to do this technique, you want to get your paper a little bit wet with water. And from there, you want to go in and start adding some colors. I'm going to do a few different types of blues and greens, maybe colors you might see in an ocean. I'm going to blend that in, that green. It's a little bright and a little bit more blue. All right. Once you have this created, you've painted a good section of your paper. But before it is dry, you need to blot away some of the water. Now, when you go to do this, you're pulling up some of the paint as well, which is giving you a value of color, some of which has less paint, some of which has more paint. This effect would be good for water or a sky where you want some things to appear a little bit lighter and some things to appear a little bit darker. Created by just removing some of that color. You can see it here on my paper towel, it's been taken away. The next one is called wet on wet. This technique, you want to really saturate your paper with water. You want to make sure there's no dry spots left in the section you are trying to paint. So I'm really making sure this is wet with water, like a slippery slide. And then you also want to make sure the inkwell that you are going to use for this is wet as well. I'm going to put down some water in a couple colors here, and then take some of this color, a nice soaking wet paintbrush, and I'm just going to kind of release that paint onto the surface of that water. Now, in this case, I'm kind of trying to make a sunset. Again, I'm not stroking my paintbrush back and forth. I'm just kind of, as I described before, releasing that paint onto the surface of the water, almost like dabbing it on the surface. This will create blurred lines between the colors. If you can see, I kind of tried to make a sunset effect here with my wet on wet technique. Putting water down on the paper, making sure you have really good wet paint, and just applying it to the surface of the water, making sure that you have an effect of blurred lines when you're finished. The next is dry brush. This technique, as in the title, you want to have the tip of your paintbrush dry. In order to do that, you might want to dry it on a paper towel or just kind of squeeze it between your fingers and squeeze the water out on your hand. It also gives this paintbrush a really nice little pointy hairdo tip that is good for the dry brush technique. Now, you want to just dip the tip of your paintbrush in the paint and then try to paint with just the tip of that paintbrush. You want to use a lot of hand control in order to get thin, crisp lines of color. I'm really using my hand to only allow the tip of that paintbrush to touch the surface. I'm going to give that nice pointy hairdo again and get some more color. Try out some curved lines. And maybe I try out to do some texture that you might see in class. This is for details, for getting nice thin lines of color. And the last one is called Crayon Resist. You might have done this in elementary school. Crayon Resist is where you apply crayon to the paper and then you paint on top of it. When you paint on top of it, the paint is water soluble and the crayon has wax in it. So when you paint over top of this, the crayon is going to show through and pop up, and the watercolor is going to fade to the background. The crayon is resisting the watercolor and not allowing it to stay on its surface. Because the crayon is wax and it has an oil base to it, it will pop through to the top, just like in the experiment where you mix water with oil. Oil always rises and the water will sink to the bottom or back to the paper in this case. Those are 4 techniques that we could apply into our watercolor landscape artwork next time when you are in class. I hope you enjoyed watching my video about watercolor techniques. Can't wait to see you next time.